Greetings, friends of liberty. I do hope that I won't try your patience as I perfect my 21st century American accent. As promised in my first video, in this, my second, I shall begin to describe the actual cause of political correctness, dividing this treatment into 4 parts. The basis for these videos, incidentally, comes from my own 18-page manuscript that has been refused publication. From a publisher from the continent of convicts, no less. Extraordinary. Of course, back home in 18th century London, every essay, missive, or even brief poem I compose is eagerly printed by the Times, but here in the 21st century, editorial acceptance is apparently proving more begrudging. Nonetheless, I shall begin this video with the first of 3 important factors in explaining the rise of political correctness: the demographic. In the United States, in 1910, approximately 2% of individuals had completed 4 years of college, while in 2020, approximately 36% had, an 18-fold increase. Or, to put it another way, in 1776, approximately 0.03% of the population were in college in any given year, whereas in 2018, approximately 6% were, a more than 200-fold increase. Secondly, in the United States in 1910, the ideas that were taught in the universities, in colleges, were often better, that is, more accurate in many respects, historically, economically, and philosophically, than they were in 2020. Although no single source could document this deterioration over the last century, plus those who have described this decline more recently include organizations such as the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, the National Association of Scholars, and the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, think tanks such as Cato, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and the Heritage Foundation, online periodicals such as National Review and Reason, and individual books too numerous to mention, among them William F. Buckley's God and Man at Yale, 1951, Alston Chase's Group Memory, 1980, Roger Kimball's Tenured Radicals, 1990, Horowitz and Laxkin's One-Party Classroom, 2009, and Thomas Sowell's Inside American Education, 2010. The synergistic combination of these 2 demographic and institutional factors means that the American system of higher education, and K-12 derivatively, has become, especially over the last 70 years, an effective method of gradually poisoning the entire society, intellectually and academically, by exposing relatively huge swaths of the population to the now inferior ideas and ideologies regnant in the academy. And once these indoctrinated students graduate, they metastasize these cancerous notions to virtually every societal institution, commercial, educational, governmental, artistic, scientific, and philanthropic, of which they become a part. Thus, the demographic and institutional mechanics of political correctness. Let's now turn to the second important factor, the ideological. Here I shall ask a simple question. If any ideology arises in human societies, any at all, what is often the single greatest force at work that causes it to arise, or to maintain itself once it has arisen? Indeed, if we simply survey other historical ideologies, the religious such as Christianity and Islam, and the secular such as Communism and Fascism, we can see that one important force is almost always present to some degree. Let us look then at what this force might be by examining 4 cases, since it would be logical in our present case to check whether that same force is at work. Case number 1, Christianity. Although Christianity spread peaceably during its first 300-odd years before becoming a state religion in 380 AD, it evolved toward the medieval and later Spanish, Portuguese, and Roman Inquisitions, profitably undertaken in conjunction with state violence. Incorporating Paul's peace of God, which passes all understanding, consistently into the fabric of its institutions. It slaughtered ethnic Saxons, Balts, Slavs, Finns, North and South American Indians, and heretical Cathars, Lollards, Huguenots, and Hussites. In England, the list of its atrocities, with the publication of Fox's Book of Martyrs, fueled the English Reformation, and with Christian preeminence also came a most pure expression of anti-Semitism, with killings, pogroms, and expulsions occurring throughout Christendom for over a millennia and a half. However, with the release of the individual mind occasioned by Gutenberg's press, the subsequent Reformation and breakaway of the Protestant nations bore vivid testimony to how extensively the power of church and state had stifled the free expression of less supernatural Christian beliefs for centuries. The Catholic hierarchy understood full well that without its rack, hangmen, and pyre, belief in a supernatural Christ would wane. And so with its loosening of the coercive Catholic stranglehold on belief in education, the Enlightenment, and the intellectual freedom of modernity derived from the geographical separation from the coercive Catholic states resulted in majorities in all countries no longer adhering to many of the superstitious dogmas, the virgin birth, the Trinity, Christ as sacrificial scapegoat, and the transubstantiation previously forced upon generations. In addition, specifically Christian doctrines were, as with most religions, uniformly indifferent to the horrors of existential slavery, and thus it was only with the advent of the Age of Reason and the increased societal and economic productivity born of it through the Industrial Revolution that both the moral and practical impetus to end slavery began. In addition, throughout its history, Christianity has received tax exemptions, compulsory tithes, and state financial support, the French church's revenue being an alleged 150 million livres in 1789, or about 25% of the entire 1780 revenue of the government itself, through which revenue the French church, like others in Europe, had facilitated the spread of religious propaganda and indoctrination through its monasteries, convents, churches, and religious schools. Number 2, Islam. Even more than the sword of Christianity, Islam has been spread and maintained by the scimitar, its coercion derived from the very beginning by its hatred of opposition and disagreement, as expressed throughout the Quran by its author, no turning of the other cheek for him. I quote, verse 9:5, "So when the sacred months expire, kill the polytheists wherever you find them, and catch them, and besiege them, and sit in ambush for them everywhere." Verse 9:29, "Fight against those who do not obey Allah, and who do not believe in Allah or the last day, until they pay the religious tax with willing submission, and feel themselves subdued." Verse 47:4, "When you meet the unbelievers, smite their necks." Verse 4:34, "And as to those women from whom you fear obedience, give them a warning, send them to separate beds, and beat them." Verse 2:23, "Your wives are as a tilth unto you, so approach your tilth when or how you will." The list of Muslim rights violations in general, and of forced conversions, massacres, and rapes in particular, is too lengthy for detailed recitation here. A likely conservative estimate simply for the total murders of innocents between the African slave trade to the Middle East and wars of jihad against the infidel Christian, Zoroastrian, Hindu, and Buddhist exceeding 50 million. Consistent with its intolerance, as of 2017, death for apostasy was on the books, whether or not enforced, in 13 Muslim countries. Thus, we must ask, how many Muslims living today would believe if not for the positive coercive rewards and negative sanctions exercised for over a millennia by this unreformed religion? Quite possibly, a small minority of the present 1.8 billion. Shall we not perhaps sum up the intellectual costs of these two cores of religious ideologies by comparing them with Judaism, which has never in modern history had a state to privilege its spread, and which possesses by far the largest percentage of Nobel Prize winners in history over all religions whose respective countries have used state violence on their behalf? The present 15 million Jews and their forefathers have won in chemistry, physics, medicine, and economics from 1901 to 2000, 119 Nobels, as opposed to the 37 Nobels for the 1.4 billion Catholics and 2 for the 1.8 billion Muslims. Thus, cores of religions are correlated with and are likely at least partially causative in producing relatively ignorant and violent and politically correct adherents. Yes, there is a bit remaining there. And now to secular ideologies. Number 3, communism. Present-day mainland China is a perfect and ongoing example demonstrating how knowledge suppression can be used to create or maintain politically correct narratives. Tiananmen Square, gone from Sino-cyberspace. Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh, a delightful meme, only shared and enjoyed outside of mainland China. The attempts by heroic Dr. Li Wenliang to warn his countrymen against the dangers of the developing COVID-19 pandemic, ignored or condemned, and other subsequent whistleblowers or medical reporters and journalists silenced or disappeared. COVID is having been created in the US and transported to an innocent China? A conspiracy theory which gained surprisingly wide traction behind the Great Firewall. Suppression of the facts that China is engaging in genocide of the Uyghurs and Tibetans? And on, the constant drumbeat and creation of self-serving nationalistic propaganda also used across the border in North Korea, where those who have escaped, like Yeonmi Park, give detailed testimony as to how well totalitarian regimes suppress information and glorify the personhood and alleged accomplishments of their dictators, just as China did with Mao and increasingly does with Xi. Number 4, fascism. As with communism, the totalitarian leaders of fascistic countries suspect how illogical to root their own belief systems are, and so they quickly resort to concentration camps, squadrons of brown shirts, state media censorship, book burnings, and Olympic spectacles to maintain and promote their conceptual monopoly and enforce obedience to their irrational dictates. To focus on one former fascistic country, that of Germany, the economist Ludwig von Mises summarized the destructive governmental influence on economics in Germany with the result that German universities of the 19th and early 20th century were, although giving lip service to the concept of academic freedom, overwhelmingly dominated by one inferior school of economic thought, the German historical school. Von Mises, in his book The Historical Setting of the Austrian School of Economics, mentions how the state, through control of all civil service appointments, directly or indirectly, influenced who became economics professors in many German and Prussian universities, and even sometimes indirectly in Austrian and Swiss universities. He mentions how these professors were often bad economists who advocated for nationalism, unnecessary arms production, and protectionism, which is why they were appointed. And finally, he mentions that as a result of these factors, the German historical school, which in essence denied the fundamental principles of the science of economics, became predominant. Thus, the discipline of economics was damaged in Germany, despite existing amongst the people enormously supportive of educational attainment as Germans were and are. And, shall we ask, what became of Prussia and Germany as a result, at least in part? Was the corruption of this discipline not partially to blame for the millions who subsequently died, precisely because it had been made a mouthpiece for German nationalism and fascism through state appointments of professors who would toe the party line? So to finally sum up this argument, in every one of the listed cases, coercion, usually enforced by the state, was partially or highly instrumental in propagating a politically correct belief system. In the next video, we shall transfer our focus to American higher education, where I shall outline the specific rights violations that the U.S. government committed over the course of more than a century to damage the productivity and integrity of our universities, with the result that they too are now increasingly colonized by an ever more irrational set of politically correct ideologies. Until then, I wish you all well, and remain as ever the Scarlet Pimpernel.